The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John. Glory to you, O Lord. When it was evening, the disciples of Jesus went down to the sea, embarked in a boat, and went across the sea to Capernaum. It had already grown dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea was stirred up because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they began to be afraid. But he said to them, "It is I. Do not be afraid." They wanted to take him into the boat, but the boat immediately arrived at the shore to which they were heading. The Gospel of the Lord. Yeah, it's a remarkable little gospel, and again, it's very significant to tie it to the Acts of the Apostles, that first reading that we had. So we're making this this Easter pilgrimage together with the strength of those two witnesses, both the gospel, what Jesus is up to there, and what the apostles have taken it to mean, and how they are continuing to make their Jesus-shaped way through the world. But here it's remarkable because in this chapter of St. John, the 6th chapter, of course, we're inclined to hear it as the Eucharistic chapter of St. John. I think that's absolutely right. It's totally fine, right? It's a good thing to do that. But what we see is these events being situated in such a manner, and the stories being retold in such a manner that they point back to the Exodus and they point forward to Jesus' Exodus. So you have the Exodus that God achieves through Moses, and then we hear in the echo of the previous scene, this is the one who is to come. This is the prophet, right? They're excited about Jesus to come and carry him off and make him king, and we're supposed to hear that Exodus narrative, and then we point forward to Jesus's resurrection, and even his resurrection appearances. This is not one of them, right? This is the life of Jesus prior to his death and resurrection. But we get some of the strangeness of the resurrection appearances in this account. It's like the disciples, they've rowed what, 3 or 4 miles here across the sea? Yeah, well, that's what it says, 3 or 4 miles. I was taking a guess, but that's what it says. They've rowed 3 or 4 miles across the sea. I don't know about you, but when I I actually gave up my rowing machine for the bike. Yeah, I know, but it's not easy to row 3 or 4 miles, even on a machine. But the wind working against you, and the waves, and of course seems like it was pretty dark and then you think there's a ghost chasing us, like this is impossible. What is going on here? But it's that kind of we don't quite recognize Jesus at first. That's the quality that we see in the resurrection narratives, right? The appearances of Jesus after the resurrection. But here we find it as well. It's so strange, right? And Jesus said, it is I, don't be afraid. So, well, we're kind of afraid anyway because you're walking on the water. It's like there's something going on here that's beyond our control. Whenever things are beyond our control, we start to panic a little bit, right? So, but here the disciples, they're making their way. In fact, they're making their way at the command of Jesus. We get this story in the other Gospels as well, and the disciples are making their way, of course, at Jesus' command. They're rowing because Jesus has commanded them to go. Right, they have to get to the other side of the sea, and it's perhaps 7 miles. I'm not actually that good with topography of first century Israel, but it's likely 7 miles they've got to go, right? And they're struggling in the face of what Jesus has asked them to do, but they're persevering. This is where I would tie this gospel reading to the narrative in the Acts of the Apostles that we have, because there's not actually that much clear indication as to what Jesus has commanded them to do in this specific instance, like the nomination of good men to be deacons, to distribute food to the widows and all that kind of thing. But what we see is that they're rising, so they're going beyond themselves in the power of the resurrection. They're rising to meet the demands of love. And that is part of it's the major part of the contour of their story, of their narrative, of the early church. They're rising to meet the demands of love. They know that that's the journey that they've been called to. That's the journey that Jesus has equipped them for, and that's what he's going to give them the strength to persevere in. So that's what's going on. But here, right, is also an image of the early church in the ship. I shouldn't say the early church. Is an image of the church, faithful followers of Jesus, rowing across the sea, and again pointing back to the Exodus narrative. Not only Israel making their way through the Red Sea waters, but at the head is Moses, that prayerful man who's been given the word of God. He's his prophet. He's leading the way, and he's leading them through the chaos and confusion of the waters to safety, right, to the dry land. And so that even points back to the creation narrative, but we'll get that deep, right? It's like Inception. There's too many layers here. We'll point forward instead to Jesus' resurrection and the exodus that he accomplishes, the defeat of the enslaving and corrupting forces of sin and death, that he's made his way through the waters of death, just as we've been baptized in them. We've made our way through the waters of death. We've risen with him, just as he has risen, to live life totally for God, beyond the corrupting forces of sin and death. And when Jesus makes his way through, beyond, he is the one then who breathes his life into his followers to nourish and sustain them on the way and to get them safely to the shore. Even here, like beyond their wildest imagining, right? Jesus comes, he's on the scene, and then they're at the shore. They didn't have to row the next, it seems like anyway, they didn't have to row the next 3 miles. And that's a relief. That's a relief. But there he is Jesus, and it may or may not be that they had to row the next few miles. But with Jesus on the scene, that's all that matters. So you got to row, you don't have to row. It actually doesn't matter. That's why that detail is not included in the story. Because Jesus is on the scene, he demands all our attention. And then we go his way, the way in which, again, he nourishes and sustains us, he draws us on and the rest. And that's all we care about. So we come out of this narrative today, and it's simple faithfulness, whether it's from the Acts of the Apostles or from the gospel today. We, with Christ, yes, we make our way through the waters of death. We have made our way through the waters of death. We are to resist the corrupting forces of sin and death, of chaos, destruction, the rest. We have risen to live life totally for God. And what that means is that Jesus is always at the center. And if Jesus is at the center of our hearts and lives, we have very little to worry about, because he will nourish and sustain us in the way that he's gone, the way that he now inspires us to go with him.